Hello, hello, everyone. Welcome back to Nonprofit Enthusiast Live. I'm your host, Lasheena Williams, and so excited to be here with you all, kicking off this month's conversation on the foundation of impact and introduction to nonprofit essentials. What better way to start out the new year? We have our very special guest with us today, Representative Anna Eskamani, and I'm going to tell you all a little bit about her before we bring her up. Anna Eskamani is a fearless champion for Florida families and everyday people, blending bold leadership with a genuine heart for service. Growing up in Orlando as the daughter of immigrants, Anna's story is a testament to the power of perseverance and purpose. From excelling in Orange County public schools to earning dual degrees and a PhD in public administration at UCF, whoop, whoop, go Knights, and Anna has always been driven by a passion for building a better world. In 2018, Anna made history as Florida's first Iranian American State House representative. Since then, she's transformed her platform into a bridge for meaningful change, advocating for housing affordability, economic justice, healthcare access, and so much more. Her experience and background as a nonprofit advocate and former senior director at Planned Parenthood has equipped her with tools to make a tangible difference both in policy and for individual families. So we are so excited to have her on the show today and glean insight on nonprofit essentials. Hello, hello, and welcome.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
So glad to have you and just get your insight on the basics of nonprofit and learn more about your journey working in the nonprofit and public sector. So thank you so much for joining us.
Oh my God, it's such a treat. And thanks for bringing this information directly to people in such an accessible way. It's so important.
Yay. One thing about the nonprofit journey that I learned very early on is you cannot do it alone. So the goal of these lives is being able to just, share the resources so together we can have a greater impact in the community.
Yeah, so well said.
Awesome. So I'm going to start out with if you can tell us about how your personal background and journey shaped your passion for nonprofit work and public service.
Oh, absolutely. So many folks might know that I grew up in Orlando, and you
Okay.
mentioned it in my bio as well. And
Mhm.
thank you for
Mhm.
that. And
Yeah.
so I'm born and raised in Central Florida. Went to Orange County Public Schools, K to 12, and grew up in an immigrant family. So my parents were
Mhm.
actually both immigrants from Iran, but met
Mhm.
each other working at the same donut shop in Orlando.
Oh.
And they were working class as well. So I always witnessed my parents' hard work. And like so many families, regardless of how hard you work, it's still difficult to get by. In fact, my parents worked multiple jobs to make ends meet. My mom worked at Kmart, which really dates me, but that's, like a Walmart of the 90s.
Mhm. Right?
and, uh, and of course, during that time, my dad was a student at UCF as working as a waiter and trying to get his degree in electrical engineering. And even after he became an engineer, he worked part time at Walt Disney World to make ends meet for our family. And so I think witnessing that hard work and also witnessing how so many families just struggle to get by was foundational for me and caring about the underdog and caring about
Mhm.
lifting up families into a place of more security. Part of that life experience was also navigating my mom's diagnosis with cancer. So, unfortunately, my mom
Mhm.
was diagnosed with cancer when I was about 10 years old, and then she passed away when I was 13.
Mhm.
And so, during that time, I was also her caregiver and saw not only her courageous fight, but of course, her body getting more sick over time, but the fights that we would have with insurance companies, with just trying to make sure she had the best care as a person of color. And so those
Mhm.
experiences too, were really important for me in kind of building my value system and wanting to champion these types of everyday issues that families go through. I fast forward that timeline to when I get to UCF, and so go Knights, charge on.
Yeah.
For me, UCF was a natural choice because, as I mentioned, my dad went to UCF. We're growing up in Orlando. One reason why my parents chose Orlando to raise their family, and I am blessed to have a twin sister and a big brother as well. All of us went to UCF primarily because our mom really wanted us to. She wanted us to stay local for school. not carry additional debt, and really try to do best what we had in front of us. And UCF is just such a big part of who I am. And in those years as my undergraduate work, I really just got exposed to so many amazing issues in nonprofit organizations. In fact, one of the first orgs I volunteered with at UCF was Dress for Success, which those don't know, a nonprofit here in our community that helps women make a tailored transition back to the workforce. And I got to volunteer in the boutique, help clients pick out their outfits for job interviews, and really get to also hear their stories and see the connection between the disparities they faced in real life to what I was reading in my textbooks. So all of that kind of came together to set a strong foundation for me to care about these issues and, of course, to want to get more involved in the nonprofit sector.
Awesome. So this month, our theme is on just the basics of nonprofit, just getting great at the basics. So a lot of our audience, we have audience across various areas of the nonprofit. It can be a board member, intern, executive director. But of course, we know all the foundational tools that's needed for starting a nonprofit is crucial in order to have a strong organization. So the next question I have for you is kind of bringing your worlds together, the nonprofit and public sector. Advocacy plays a huge role in the nonprofit sector. What advice do you have for nonprofits looking to engage in advocacy work?
Such a great question. And to provide a little bit more additional context to my lived experiences with this. So
Hmm.
my very first job out of college was at a nonprofit organization, Planned Parenthood of
Hmm.
Southwest and Central Florida. And Planned Parenthood is a very unique nonprofit organization because not only is Planned Parenthood a direct healthcare service provider, but also engages in public community health education, engages in advocacy, and also does advocacy in the nonprofit charitable C3 way, but also engages with what are called C4s and even political committees. Now, of course, that type of arena carries a lot of risk. And there's a reason why a lot of nonprofits don't want to tap into it, right? Because there's just
Hmm.
a lot of layers, a lot of tax compliance, and so forth. So, to the heart of your question, there are some more, I would say, uh, effective ways to be an advocate while still maintaining your C3 status.
Hmm.
The biggest line to never cross is electoral, right? So if you're a C3 organization, you should not be endorsing candidates, donating to candidates as a nonprofit organization. You have to be really careful about any type of engagement with candidates. And that could
Hmm.
even take shape as if a candidate wants to tour your health center. Be careful with that type of ask,
Hmm.
right? Or
Hmm.
maybe offer the invitation to everyone in that race to not show bias. But you have to be really
Hmm.
careful in that arena. However, when it comes to issue based advocacy and the legislature, you have a lot more flexibility. In fact, I would argue that nonprofit organizations are needed in the legislature because you are on the ground every single day seeing the challenges that our constituents are navigating, whether it's economic oriented, healthcare oriented, the criminal justice system. Maybe you are a passionate animal rights activist and your nonprofit focuses on those issues. Maybe you're environmentalists and you're providing some sort of recycling service. Whatever the focus of your organization, whatever your mission is, you are the expert in that field. And so coming to the state legislature, in our case in Tallahassee, but I know you have a large audience, so whatever that
Hmm.
capital is for you, getting to know who your state representative and state senators are, tracking legislation that intersects with your work, helping to activate your community, the people that you serve, to be storytellers. One of my favorite organizations that I work with is called uh, Florida Voices for Health, and they do a lot of advocacy when it comes to Medicaid and different types of access to dental care and so forth. But they also collect stories, and they will amplify the stories of folks who are maybe navigating a denial from insurance company. They bring those stories to the state capitol so that there can be a push for policy change. So there are some ways to balance your advocacy. Just be thoughtful to that line. And obviously, It's great if you have legal counsel, maybe a board member that's an attorney that you can lean on for some of this guidance. But if
Mm-hmm.
not, there also are organizations that can provide you with pro bono legal support, Legal Aid Society,
Mm-hmm.
Centers for Legal Services. That's two examples here in our community. So,
Mm-hmm.
not sure, ask, right? But that goes back to why you want to have a really strong board, because hopefully your
Mm-hmm.
board provides you with some guidance as well.
Love that. And thank you for sharing that because oftentimes as C3 organizations, just to play it safe, you just stay away from the whole like talking about issues, anything. You just stay away from like advocacy as a whole. But then also we know that it's important, especially when it comes to certain issues within the community for nonprofit voices to be heard and present at the table. But then of course, doing it mindfully, keeping in mind your C3 status. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Absolutely.
Okay, so um, what are some strategies nonprofits can use to build trust and engage meaningfully with the communities that they serve?
It's another great question. My first thought is showing up in communities without any type of ask, right?
Mhm,
And the good thing about nonprofits is that nonprofits are natural givers, right? We're here to
mhm,
give support, to provide services, but sometimes there's also needs, right? Whether
mhm,
it's dollars to support our work or marketing support or partnerships. But I do think it's important that before you make asks, that you show up to demonstrate more of a transformational approach versus one that's transactional. Because
mhm,
again, something that really contrasts with nonprofits, the private sector, is not really supposed to be a competition, right? We're supposed to be working
mhm,
together for the common good, for the greater good. And you got to practice that. You can't just
mhm,
assume that. And so,
mhm,
for example, when I was working more full time in a nonprofit sector, I would attend community meetings just as a listener. I wasn't there to
mhm,
necessarily dictate the conversation or even sometimes have an opinion. I was just there to learn and listen. I also think it's really important if you are a nonprofit organization serving a specific community, whether it's a specific demographic of people or a specific zip code. If you don't have roots in that community, really important to build those roots, right?
mhm,
To show up and listen, to ask, what can I do for you before you make any assumptions and before
mhm,
you ask for something for yourself, right?
mhm,
And also think about those diverse stakeholders. Maybe it's faith-based community partners, maybe it's the community center or the public library folks, maybe it's a small business in the area, right? That you can build that relationship with. And so think about, even as a nonprofit organization, how can you use your platform, your resources to uplift those that you're working to serve? And maybe it's hosting your meetings at that coffee shop, in the district, or if you're hosting a board meeting, catering with one of those local businesses, really trying to just embed yourself, right? And so
mhm,
people build that trust with you. And I also think that whether it's philanthropic dollars that are private or corporate or big or small, I think supporters of your mission would also be really inspired by those types of efforts you're taking to build
mhm,
lasting trust in a community versus, kind of being dropped in and making assumptions and
mhm,
not really building that long term trust with those who you hope to serve. And I think when you are intentional in that way, the notion of giving without expectation will have benefits. You might not know what they
mhm.
are yet, but it definitely will reflect back on you and your organization in a positive way.
Awesome, thank you. I love that you shared kind of going in the community. I'm hearing kind of like seeing watching and seeing kind of like what some of the needs are within the community, and yeah, thank you.
Absolutely.
I'm just I'm like this. That's really good. Okay, so all right. So, what do you hope your work, both in the nonprofit and political realms, leaves behind for future generations of leaders and advocates?
Well, my first thought is I really want, especially younger leaders in these spaces, to know that their voices count and that they are desperately needed. We look at the political landscape in our country and right here in Florida, there's a really huge generational gap between the folks who are in office compared
Mhm.
to those who are the majority of our demographics. And that separation leads to a policy agenda that doesn't always reflect the shared values and the shared needs of our generationally diverse community. And the only way to counter that is to be a part of the process, to find your voice, to pick the issues that you care about and to champion those at the neighborhood level, at the city level, the county level, but also at the state and federal level to really help see yourself as more than just that nonprofit leader, but also as that nonprofit advocate. And
Mhm.
good leaders build new leaders. So I do a lot of work in just mentoring others to find their voice, but to also understand
Mhm.
how the system works and doesn't work. And this is really important because you do have a lot of folks who are incredibly passionate about solving problems and see a problem and want to address it, but they don't always have the knowledge to understand, okay, what level of government does this intersect with? Who are the decision makers that I can influence to help change this? Um, where do I need to position myself to have influence over this decision? And so I always try to be an educator, just like how you're leading with this podcast, right? To teach
Mhm.
people, okay, you've watched Schoolhouse Rock before of how bill becomes the law. Let's talk about in the context of the state legislature, right? Who are
Mhm.
the decision makers in Tallahassee? How would you track legislation? How would you testify on a bill? And also again,
Mhm.
bring it down to local level. How would you go to a city hall meeting or county commission meeting, right? And kind of breaking down those barriers for folks. And I
Mhm.
think when you're able to make it more tangible, less nebulous, it inspires people to actually take that first step, to go to a public hearing, to send in an email to their lawmaker. And notice I haven't mentioned voting, and voting is
Mhm.
very important, and voting is a essential part of this equation. But there's so
Mhm.
much more to do beyond voting. Yeah, I meet a lot of
Mhm.
folks who are like, "Well, I did my job, I voted," and it's like, "All right, well, step one, I'm glad you did it." But it's actually
Mhm.
not the only thing you can do. There's so much more you can do to accomplish your vision and secure the change that you seek. But a part of it is understanding how these systems work and don't work and plugging yourself into them.
Love it. Um, do you have any other tips that you would like to share with the nonprofits tuning in today?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I kind of alluded to a few already, right? I mean, definitely,
Oh,
if you don't know
yep.
who your state representative or state senator is, get to know them.
Mhm.
And also keep in
Mhm.
mind that you can request state funding. So it's not an easy process, don't get me wrong, but every
Mhm.
nonprofit should know that the legislature goes through an annual budget appropriation process that you can be a part of. And so keep
Mhm.
that in mind. Also, sometimes there's grant dollars that come down to the state of Florida or come through the state of Florida that might be able to support you in your work. But understanding who your representatives are can be important, not
Mhm.
just from a funding perspective, but also from a regulatory perspective. Maybe you're having an issue with a state agency, whether it's DOH, DCF, DOC, to be able to know who your lawmaker is, to ask them for assistance. I've had nonprofits reach out to me who are facing issues with uh, things like certificates of occupancy, and they're having trouble
Mhm.
getting that through to open up their new location, for example. A local elected official can help you navigate some of those bureaucratic challenges. But the
Mhm.
other part of this work, going back to the grassroots, I really want to advise local nonprofits to always put yourselves in the shoes of those who you serve, to accept criticism as a growing opportunity, especially
Mhm.
if it's coming from the community. Because I know sometimes we can get defensive, but that criticism, if you read it in a more open-minded way and you kind of keep your
Mhm.
heart full and your eyes clear, sometimes you can actually learn something from it. And so I really want to encourage folks to be open to that
Mhm.
type of feedback as well. It can make you a lot stronger and more effective. And sometimes folks who criticize you can become your best allies depending on how you manage that criticism. So always want to emphasize that too. And the last point I'll make is the importance of things like marketing. I
Mhm.
know a lot of nonprofit organizations, understandably so, don't have a marketing budget, but there are some creative ways that you can try to lift up your organization, brand your organization's voice with not a whole lot of money, just a little bit of time. And so there's a lot of other organizations, including nonprofits, that can help with that type of support.
Mhm.
But don't be shy, to create that Instagram account or the Facebook account. I know in the
Mhm.
beginning it might feel like you're not getting any traction, but you got to start somewhere. So definitely take ownership of that, but be responsive. I see some folks start a social media page for their nonprofit and then they don't update it or they're not reading their
Mhm.
messages. So just know that once you're putting yourself out there, you also have to be responsive to those who want to get involved or those who want to benefit from your services.
Awesome. So question for you. I'm gonna go back to a few things that you mentioned. So you talked about your lawmakers. If you, let's say you're having an issue with a certain agency and being able to reach out to them, knowing who your representatives are. Um, would you say that a nonprofit, it's beneficial to gain that relationship before, I guess, needing the lawmaker, or either way, it works?
That's a really great question. I think it's always better to build a relationship proactively
Mhm.
versus in crisis. And so, even if you, as I mentioned earlier, even if you don't have any type of ask, you just want to
Mhm.
introduce yourself to the lawmaker or to the city official or maybe the school board member. I think that's really good practice. So, to reach out proactively, to introduce yourself, the work that you do, and to exchange contact information, to keep in touch, and then, of course, if something does happen, you'll have that line of communication ready to go.
Awesome. Okay. And then the other thing you mentioned was budget appropriation. I know if I don't say, like, funding is like the, nonprofits, you hear funding, that's like the top topic, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
I just want to go back to, you mentioned budget appropriation and grant dollars available within states for nonprofit organizations. It's a couple questions around this. When would you say a nonprofit is ready to take that leap and ask, for those appropriations? And then
Right.
where would you say they should start?
Really, really good question. So the state appropriations process is somewhat political. So I have to provide
Mhm.
that disclaimer. It's not
Okay.
necessarily merit-based. It's not necessarily um, a program that you can predict, right? So to kind of walk you
Hmm.
through the process, y- you would basically find a legislator in the House and the Senate in both chambers who would
Okay.
file a request for your organization. And you could craft the request whatever you feel like are your funding needs. Now, again, I would really recommend if your first time applying, this is not something to fund your entire annual budget. Like, ideally, this is for a program or maybe a capital investment. The legislature loves to see matching dollars. So maybe you have the county putting in money to help you and you're trying to match it. Maybe you have a private donor who's putting in some money and you're trying to match it. And the form you have to fill out is pretty in depth. It's going to ask a lot of ROI questions, how this impacts different parts of civil society in the state of Florida. But once you get through some of those, kind of like application logistical processes, then it gets filed with the legislature, and you basically are advocating to try to get your request into the state budget. That's why the process is very political, because depending on
Hmm.
the lawmaker you work with, depending on if you have the money to hire a lobbyist, depending on
Hmm.
all these other factors around you, can really determine the outcome of if you're even able to get into the budget. And if you get into the
Hmm.
budget, at how much? Because sometimes you request, 100,000, but you get 50,000, right?
Hmm.
And then even when you get into the budget, there's something called the governor's line item veto. So
Hmm.
governor can actually veto individual projects that he doesn't feel are worthy of state funding. And unfortunately, he vetoes some pretty hefty projects. In fact,
Hmm.
this past legislative session, Governor Ron DeSantis vetoed the entire arts and culture budget in Florida.
Hmm.
So these were very well vetted nonprofit organizations that went through a state process to get high enough to receive some state funding. And so he vetoed the entire funding. And in this situation, it wasn't individual organizations, it was just the budget line that was vetoed, and that
Mhm.
hurt, hundreds of nonprofits in Florida. So, unfortunately, the legislative process, though it is one I encourage nonprofits to engage with, it's not something I would ride your budget on because it's just not a very predictable option. But I
Mhm.
think it is worth trying and getting involved with because, like I said, there have been many success stories of nonprofits bringing money into their organization from the state. There is oversight with that. You do have to, report to a specific
Mhm.
state agency. And it's not just nonprofits who make these requests. Municipalities do as well. Sometimes private sector companies try to, but the top two recipients are often going to be municipalities or a
Mhm.
nonprofit organization.
Awesome. Thank you for that. All right. Any others? Let's say if what's one piece of advice or encouragement you'd like to leave with our audience today as they strive to make a difference in the community?
I mean, my first thought is just thank you. Thank you, thank you,
Mhm.
thank you for what you do because I know it's not easy. I still work in the nonprofit sector today. I serve on many nonprofit boards as well. But if there's one piece of advice I could give you, it would be to really consider the importance of board recruitment and of
Mhm.
following your bylaws because I've served on a lot of nonprofit boards where the bylaws are not being clearly followed in the sense that you have some board members who have been there for way beyond their terms. And
Mhm.
as much as I love to see that admiration and support, it has an impact on your longevity and on your ability to adapt and to evolve and to bring in new people for accountability and oversight. And
Mhm.
unfortunately, there's been some fantastic nonprofits, even in our community, that because of some of those elements, they financially don't make it, or there's some sort of controversy that happens. And so, nonprofits still need to operate with a lot of due diligence. Sometimes they can feel more casual because I know when many nonprofits start, the first board members often tend to be friends, right? Because you're just trying
Mhm.
to build this out. So you have to have board members. You're going to dip into your personal network to make that happen. But you got to be intentional in expanding that board beyond your personal network to expand it to new people, new places, new faces. And
Mhm.
that will not only help you build that longevity, but again, board members are really supposed to help carry different pieces of the organization. And so when you're planning out that board recruitment strategy, you can ask yourself where are our needs and then find those folks that fit into those categories.
Awesome, thank you. And so, how can our viewers get in touch, stay in touch, follow you? If you don't mind sharing the best way to stay in contact with
Of
you.
course, of course. So we're very active on
Mhm.
all social media platforms. You can find
Okay.
us at Anna for Florida, all spelled out with two N's, Anna for Florida. And then my email for my state legislative account is just anna.eskamani at flhouse.gov. And you can email us there at any time.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day today to have this conversation with us and just share all those amazing tips with us. We truly appreciate you coming on.
Thanks so much for having me. It was such a pleasure. And again, thanks for all you do and lifting up our nonprofit community partners.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We'll see you next week. Bye.